And I'm very pleased to be able to come here to ask you to endorse what is a coherent, costed and comprehensive transport policy that plans properly for the future. It tackles congestion, carbon emissions and the chaos that is increasingly being created by this government. The Labour record is one of increasing costs for public transport, for train and bus above inflation, and reductions in cost for motoring and especially for aviation. In other words, the less carbon you emit, the more you pay, the more carbon you emit, the less you pay. That is not a sensible transport policy from this government. And of course, we've got record levels of road traffic as well, contrary to John Prescott's firm pledge to us. We've got a programme of motorway widening, and we've got the third runway at Heathrow coming down the track as well. That is not a coherent transport policy, but at least it is a policy. Because if you ask the Tories for their policy, you will be left scratching your head, because they have no policy. They hope to get through to the next election without making any commitments whatsoever, to leave a blank piece of paper and to win on the slogan, "We are not Labour." Well, that's not good enough for the British people, and it's our job, I think, to expose the Tories for what they are. Would you get on a bus if you didn't know where it was going? Would you take a turning on the motorway when there was a question mark instead of a destination? Even on Heathrow, where they say they're clear, they don't want a third runway. Theresa Villiers, my opposite number for the Tories last month, said it doesn't necessarily rule out a third runway. So that's clear then. As far as our paper is concerned, I'm delighted by the positive response we've had to the proposals for high-speed rail. Let's be quite clear, this country is now trailing behind other major European countries in high-speed rail. The Madrid to Seville line, for example, in 3 years has taken 80% of the market from aviation, and now carry 6 million people a year on 20 trains a day each way. And it's good for economic development. And I'm determined that our high-speed network should benefit economic development across the country, not simply the South East, up through Manchester, up towards Scotland, and make sure that people in Scotland also benefit from our proposals. This is not a South East proposal. It's also good, of course, to make sure that we free up capacity. The West Coast Main Line, despite what's been spent on it, will be filled again within 15 years. The best way of increasing capacity, getting more local trains as well, more freight services we all want to see on our railways, is in fact to have a brand new rail line up the spine of the country. So there are many benefits to high-speed rail. But it's not just high-speed rail we want to improve. As you know, we want to expand the conventional rail network in a way that can be called a rail renaissance. We want to put beaching into reverse. Many lines, of course, closed under beaching should have been closed, but there were many that should not have been closed. Lines like Lewis-Uckfield, dare I say. Lines, Derek Mann, like Skipton-Colne. Lines like Matlock-Buxton. We want to see a programme of new stations and station reopenings. We want to see a redoubling of lines that should never have been singled in the first place. Exeter-Salisbury, Eastleigh-Romsey, Swindon-Kemble. These are just sensible proposals, and yet this government is doing nothing about them. Now, the beauty of this is that many of these proposals can be achieved at very low cost to the taxpayer. How? Through the extension of rail franchises held by train operating companies. And if John Clay and others say the TOCs haven't delivered, well, they've delivered in some ways with better rolling stock, but the reason they haven't delivered on these sorts of infrastructure improvements is because they've got very short franchises. Southern has been retendered for a period of 5 years and 8 months. What train operating company is going to invest in major infrastructure when it can lose its franchise again in 5 years and 8 months? So I ask you, in fact, to reject Amendment 1. It's already been mentioned that Chiltern has a long franchise, 25 years, and they're an example of what can be achieved with a long franchise. They're embarked on a big programme of improvements, including a new link between Oxford and London through a connection at Bicester. But it's also crucial to say that we're not simply abandoning matters to the private sector. Long franchises will come with a continual 5-year quality check, and if customer-based targets aren't met, the franchise can be removed. This puts the passenger first, creates a climate for investment in infrastructure, and gives the companies enough time to get a commercial payback for their investment. So I urge you to reject Amendment 1. There's other reasons, of course, for rejecting Amendment 1. What's the alternative? The alternative is to hand matters to Network Rail. And yes, there is an issue with the EU. Yes, it will have to be separated within Network Rail, so the proposal appears to be to have 2 Network Rails instead of 1. One's already got enough problems at the moment. They're responsible for more delays on the network than the train operating companies. They've got a Heath Robinson management structure, And they don't want to do this. And we're asking them to undertake a big programme of investment in our railways. We can't then ask them to take over every single rail company as well. And where does freight come in that process? Because freight would be squeezed out by a Network Rail, which ran both with services for the passengers and the network itself. It doesn't make sense. It's not back to the future. So I ask you to reject Amendment 1. Aviation's been mentioned, and I should make plain that, of course, we had a major debate on aviation last year, and those policies to remain in place. We haven't in any way abandoned our determination to tackle aviation. There is a £30 surcharge proposed in this paper to help fund the high-speed rail network, other than Lifeline flights, of course, which would not be affected by that. The average one-way ticket cost has halved in the last 10 years, from £205 for the average one-way ticket in the UK to £103. That is a disgrace in carbon terms, and we've got to tackle that. Now, I want to turn to the issue of road pricing, which has been subject to some discussion this morning. And let me say, first of all, that this is not a new idea. It's not a new idea for our conference. In September 2005, we passed a motion on road user pricing, which says conference supports move towards a system of national road user pricing within the UK, provided, and then there are 6 criteria which are met in this paper. In September 2006, the following year, Conference in its Transport and Social Exclusion motion called for the rapid introduction of a national road user pricing scheme to tackle congestion and pollution and to level out the inequalities of motoring costs across the country. That's what this motion seeks to do. And last year, Martin, when the Zero Carbon Britain paper was launched, we had Susan Kramer as the transport spokesman at that point and Chris Huhne as the environment spokesman, reiterating our commitment to a national road pricing scheme. So if you vote to take those lines out, you'll be reversing 3 years, sequential 3 years, of Lib Dem decisions at this conference to keep road pricing. And the reason road pricing is one success at previous conferences is because it's green and it's fair. It cannot be right that a motorist living in a rural area, a remote area of Scotland perhaps, or not just Scotland, but in parts of England as well, will pay more at the pump than a motorist living in central London, where there is a real choice of public transport. And the alternative to road pricing appears to be an inexorable rise in fuel duty, further worsening conditions for those who have no alternatives. That is not a green tax. That is not a green tax at all. That's a tax on people who have no alternative, and I ask you to reject that suggestion. It's also the case that if you look at road pricing in the sense of fairness, road pricing meets the criteria, because what we're seeking to do is increase the cost of travelling on those roads, motorways and trunk roads predominantly, exclusively, motorways and trunk roads, where there is by and large an alternative. So if you're travelling from London to Edinburgh, then it's right you should decide. You should decide if you've done that, you'll pay more for that journey. But that's because there's an alternative. That's a sensible green tax. But if you're driving from one village in Derbyshire to another village in Derbyshire with no public transport, then why should you be penalised for that process? And often, Martin, those are the poorest people as well, the sort of people I might see Nick Clegg was referring to yesterday in his contributions to conference and to the media subsequently. So it's a green tax that works. We're not alone in supporting road pricing. We're also supported in that objective by environmental groups, by Stephen Joseph from Campaign for Better Transport, and indeed by the British Chamber of Commerce, the RAC and the CBI. All those organisations have supported road pricing. So I ask you not to remove lines 43 to 45 and reject 3 years of Lib Dem policy at this conference. Lastly, on Amendment 2, it's up to colleagues here in the room what they take forward. It's a sensible issue raised initially, of course, when the amendment was moved. There is a genuine issue about safety at bus stops for women and men. And it's also the case that we need to do more to make bus stops visible and deal with some of the genuine concerns properly raised. I would say that the wording is such that it does imply all bus stops and making sure everything's visibly lit, even in rural areas. That's clearly not the intention of the movers of the amendment. And obviously, if it were passed by conference, and I'm not against that, then obviously when it comes to the manifesto, it will be reflected in sensible terms to make sure that that was in line with some of the comments made subsequently by others speaking against the amendment, notably by Paula Southwick. So, Conference, I urge you to accept this motion in its entirety. It is a sensible, coherent motion. It leaves the other two parties standing still, and it sets out a way forward for Britain